new report has found that the majority of schools are in the position of having to hand out food and clothing to children because of the cost of living crisis. The National Foundation for Educational Research has painted a rather alarming picture, suggesting schools are having not just to educate our children, but also supplement their basic needs. Jenna Julius, the NFER Research Director and co-author of the report, joins me now to discuss it. Jenna, this really made for pretty depressing reading. You know, we've been zooming in on education and on schools all this week, obviously starting with the Iraq crisis and so on. But you know, what's very clear is schools are already facing funding issues. Where are they finding the resources? Because the majority of schools, according to your report, are actually now having to supplement children's clothing, their food, and so on.
Good afternoon, Mariella, and thank you for having me. So I think that's exactly the point, is that really what our findings highlight is that without urgent action now, in terms of funding, there's a real risk that the cost of living crisis is going to have far-reaching and long-lasting impacts on pupils. And that draws on the fact that our report shows that cost of living pressures are having a really profound impact on pupil need, both in terms of the level of need and the scale of need. And that's not just in terms of welfare and financial needs, but we're also seeing that the cost of living crisis has really exacerbated well-being and mental health needs as well. So senior leaders in our surveys told us that over a quarter of pupils in their settings required additional support for their well-being, and that's led to schools having to provide this unprecedented level of support to pupils, as you just touched on. So, you know, the scale is astonishing. Over 87% of schools report that they are providing clothing and uniforms to some of their pupils, and I could go on. Over 70% of schools are providing some form of food support to pupils, whether that's food banks or vouchers. And
are you there?
Yes.
So we lost you for a minute. No, I mean, I was just going to. I mean, the figures are, as I've said, incredibly sobering. These are obviously problems that are naturally picked up by schools much more quickly. You know, people spend a lot of time in school with their teachers. But do you think there needs to be a third-party solution here with some degree of urgency? Because, you know, as we've said, school funding is not easy to access at the moment, and you know, this is what looks like a really, really serious situation.
I think that's exactly right. You know, schools are on the front line, whether they have the resources to do so. They're having to meet the needs of pupils and families who need this urgent support. But really, the solution lies beyond the school gates. So we know that schools are telling us that they're finding it increasingly challenging, the level of support they're getting from the wider services around them. So less than a quarter of teachers in our survey said that they were getting adequate support for child and mental health services, and we have a very similar story in terms of local authority support. And really this shows that we need to be looking at that kind of wider set of support around schools, where, you know, funding pressures we know are equally biting, and looking more broadly. And I think the key thing here is we all appreciate it's a very difficult financial kind of
environment
situation. Exactly. But the crux of it is that if we don't act now, we're storing up really kind of much worse and long-term problems for ourselves into the future.
And I suppose, you know, listeners to this station and, you know, people who have an interest in what's happening across the country will be used to hearing that the cost of living crisis is really biting, that, you know, attendance to food banks, or, you know, embracing food banks is on the rise, and all of those things. For you, in terms of putting together this report, you know, what's different and worse than what we normally talk about?
So I think what's different is it's the scale. So the scale across schools. So it's not just schools in our most deprived parts of the country, it's schools across the country. And it's that scale. So it's not just pupils who would otherwise be kind of traditionally considered to be disadvantaged. So that's where we talk about disadvantage in the context of school research. We typically talk about pupils who are eligible for free school meals. Actually, it's a much wider group of pupils. Schools are telling us that they're providing this support not just to a handful of pupils, but to many pupils who wouldn't otherwise be considered disadvantaged. In terms of the kind of schools who are most impacted, that's also a real concern. So, we know this is happening, but it's particularly affecting our most disadvantaged schools and special schools. And we know that those are some of the schools across the country that already face the most challenging circumstances.
Just finally, you just mentioned specialist schools. Teachers in specialist schools told your report that they don't have access to sort of specialist equipment that's absolutely necessary, including wheelchairs and mobility aids. And that would seem, I presume, to be a local authority problem. And then, there are measures that are meant to catch problems like this, from pupil premium, free school meals, again, local authority funding. It feels like the system isn't working. Why are none of those measures preventing what you're presenting as this hidden poverty crisis?
So I think it comes down to the fact that all parts of the system are squeezed and schools are having to step in, but the fact is the money just isn't there and the right support just isn't there. And that's why we need to be looking at solutions in terms of short-term support for schools, but also in the medium term, looking more broadly, as I said, at the services beyond schools. So it's not just that schools are stepping in to provide support with resources they don't have, but also so that pupils are getting access to the real specialist support that they need.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for showing further light on that issue. That was Jenna Julius, Research Director at the National Foundation for Education Research.